No vas a creer esta mierda. Pero lo creas o no, el cambio está aquí. Prepárate para los próximos 90 días.
I gotta give in now, I just gotta live this now. I'm gonna be, I'ma kill this stuff real quick. I'ma go take it to town, cause I gotta be that king in the ring. When I'm not getting mad, when I'm back with the will. Cause I am just off on the journey, you just know that I'm just going insane.
Arriba, guerreros, gran amanecer, buenas noches, guerreros de todo el mundo. Hombre, no vas a creer esto. Quiero compartir algo contigo. La razón por la que hago este canal de YouTube, porque hago 8 a 9 horas diarias de investigación. Tengo mi equipo de investigación, que son Good Morning Crypto, es que estuve 10 años en el sistema bancario y puedo verlo desde un nivel muy profundo. Y cuando comencé a entender cómo funciona el sistema bancario realmente y cómo funcionan realmente las reservas fraccionarias y de dónde viene realmente el dinero, realmente no hay dinero verdadero en el sistema. No me pareció éticamente correcto estar en el sistema bancario. No digo que los banqueros o los cajeros o la gente que trabaja en el banco está haciendo algo mal. No tienen ni idea. Solo están haciendo lo que se les dice que le hagan repetidamente una y otra vez. Y ese es el mayor problema de nuestra sociedad. Todo el mundo siempre dice, bueno, siempre se ha hecho así. Bueno, estoy aquí para compartir con ustedes dentro de los próximos 90 días. Está a punto de cambiar radicalmente. Si has estado viendo mi canal desde 2020, dije que China se convirtiera en la próxima superpotencia. Tuve tantas críticas, pero adivina qué, cuando veas mi video mañana verás que China, Brasil, Rusia, India, Sudáfrica están trabajando en este momento mientras te sientas aquí en Estados Unidos para desdolarizar. La única razón por la que el dólar estadounidense tiene valor es porque todo el petróleo se negocia en dólares estadounidenses y nuestra confianza en ella. Bueno, el público estadounidense está perdiendo confianza. Entonces lo que vamos a hablar hoy es el Comité de la Cámara de Representantes de Estados Unidos, la audiencia del Banco del Senado sobre las quiebras bancarias. Ahora, hay algunos jugadores claves aquí. Tenemos a Michael Barr, que vamos a ver algunas de sus respuestas con algunos de los miembros del comité. Michael Barr fue el exdirector o ex asesor de Ripple. Ahora es el asesor de la Reserva Federal. Ahora, recuerda, la Reserva Federal, te recomiendo que leas el libro La criatura de Isla Jekyll. Eso abrirá todo un paradigma para ti y entenderás lo que realmente está sucediendo. Entonces no se trata de ir y administrar los bancos y sabes sacar todo su dinero de los bancos. No es una táctica de miedo. No necesitas entrar en pánico si no tienes más de $250,000 en el banco. Solo mantente calmado. Sin embargo, lo que puedes hacer es entender, este es el mejor momento de la historia humana para crear riqueza. Al final de este video quiero mostrarles cómo ayudarnos a más de 6,000 guerreros cambiar su vida. No hay hacerse rico rápido. No creas el bombo. No creas en el sueño de hacerte rico rápido en cripto. Es necesario comprender cómo funciona realmente el sistema. Vamos a sumergirnos en esto. Así que vamos a hablar en la narración de este video. En primer lugar, esto es por lo que este caballero de aquí quiero explicarte. Este es Michael Barr. Él es el ex asesor de Ripple. ¿Está bien? Ahora lo es. Vamos a hablar de esto rápido. Él es ex asesor de Ripple, ahora ex asesor de Ripple, ahora supervisor de la Reserva Federal. Así que este caballero acaba de caer en una tormenta de fuego. Una tormenta de fuego. Los bancos están colapsando, pero sabemos que todo esto está sucediendo sistemáticamente. Todo sucediendo sistemáticamente. Así que escuchemos de lo que están hablando. Hay algunas cosas claves ahora. Esto es lo que hago todos los días, chicos. Escucho estos videos, escucho cosas claves que dicen. Recuerda, mira lo que hacen, no lo que dicen. Entonces, cuando dicen algo, uso mi circuito lógico y trato de adivinar lo mejor que puedo sobre lo que va a pasar. Así es como hago mis inversiones. Así que prestemos atención a algunas de estas cosas que dicen durante la Comisión Bancaria del Senado.
The response clearly was not an effective response. Bank managers failed to manage the firm in an appropriate way. They didn't manage their interest rate risk and their liquidity risk well, even though it was pointed out by the regulators. And I do think it calls for a heightened need for more aggressive supervisory action to take care of these problems.
But you all missed it too.
I'm sorry?
You missed it too.
The supervisory staff were aware of the underlying issues. I think all of us were caught incredibly off guard by the massive bank run that occurred when it did on March 9th and 10th. The scale and speed of that, $42 billion going out the door Thursday afternoon,
Entonces, esto es clave para entender esto, ¿bien? Así que esto es ahora un mundo digital. Lo que experimentan es totalmente diferente desde el 1929. La velocidad y la escala de cómo pasó de jueves a viernes, se liquidaron billones de dólares porque todo es digital ahora, muchachos. Las personas pudieron hacerlo en su teléfono desde su casa. No era gente esperando en fila en el banco como en 1929. Así que tienen que cambiar el sistema, ¿entiendes eso? Tienen que cambiar el sistema, muchachos. Así que fueron tomados por sorpresa. Básicamente sabían que esto vendría, por lo que tenemos que entender es que ellos saben lo que hacen las tasas de interés a la economía cuando las tasas de interés se disparan. Todos estos bancos están sentados en bonos de tesoro de 10 años. Y cuando los bonos de tesoro a 10 años, cuando las tasas de interés suben, pierden su valor. Entonces, si estás al 100%, ahora tienes un valor de 70. Ese es su dinero que se llevan y lo ponen en estos bonos del tesoro. Tu dinero se vuelve menos, liquidan el banco, la gente se asusta y nosotros somos la liquidez. Somos la liquidez. Entonces, lo que sucedió fue que las cosas comenzaron a funcionar en Twitter. Ya sabes, en un mundo de redes sociales, la gente liquidó 42 billones dentro de 24 horas durante la noche antes.
Expected by the bank that 100 billion more would go out the next day. That's just an extraordinary scale and speed of a run that not anything I had ever seen before.
Okay, out of all the banking supervisors, I would expect the Federal Reserve, and most of us would, to be the most aware of the impacts increased with rate hikes would have on the value of securities for banks. However, the Fed has stress tests, which we talked about, which are conducted to determine how large domestic banks would perform under hypothetical and stable economic scenarios, currently does not test for the problems that caused Silicon Valley Bank to fail. SFB failed because of inflation, rapid increases in interest rates, and loss in value of government bonds. So even if SFB had been subject to testing, it would not have led to the changes that could have prevented their failure because the Federal Reserve is asking the wrong questions and not running scenarios that ultimately led to SFB's downfall. So real quick, Mr. Barr, how can the American...
Muchachos, no hay nada que puedan hacer para detener esto. ¿Te das cuenta de eso, verdad? No hay nada que pueden hacer. No hay dinero en el sistema. Es solo robarle a Pedro para pagarle a Pablo. Eso es todo lo que es en este momento. No hay dinero. Somos la liquidez. No hay dinero en el sistema. No hay forma de arreglar esto que no sea una nueva economía.
People trust the Federal Reserve if you are not testing for all scenarios. How was the Federal Reserve so far off? That is a question that everyone asks again.
I think that the Federal Reserve should use multiple scenarios. That's one of the reasons why I proposed that for this year's test. It includes a rising interest rate environment for the trading book. I think multiple scenarios makes a ton of sense and should be done.
Bien, escucha lo que dice.
You know, that's saying they can get it right 100 times. You got to get it right once. So you got one crack at it. So.
Tiene una oportunidad para hacerlo bien. El ex asesor de Ripple.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. We now recognize the ranking member of the Digital Assets Subcommittee, Mr. Foster, Illinois, for 5 minutes.
Bien, entonces él es el miembro del rango del subcomité de activos digitales.
Thank you. As you know, 12 years ago during Dodd-Frank, a number of us put a lot of effort into specifically authorizing U.S. bank regulators to put contingent capital requirements into the capital stack of large banks. These can sort of be thought of as a sort of privately funded insurance policies that large banks are forced to carry that pays out if a bank gets into trouble and automatically injects capital into a struggling but not yet failed bank. Now, for the last 12 years, U.S. bank regulators have completely ignored this authorization from Congress, which I have complained about in numerous hearings. But in the last 12 years, European bank regulators and others have used contingent capital successfully. And so now I believe that we have a lot to learn about two side-by-side bank failures. First, Silicon Valley Bank, a large bank by some measure, but with total assets less than 1% of US GDP, and Credit Suisse with total assets greater than 100% of Swiss GDP, too big to fail by any metric. Now, when a couple of weekends back, the US banking regulators tried to find someone to buy SVB, they failed. The result was potential systemic risk and emergency intervention that has, by regulators, that's risked abandonment of a lot of market discipline and market chaos. And the Deposit Insurance Fund and eventually banks and their customers must take the hit. But when Swiss regulators tried to find a partner to buy out Credit Suisse, they succeeded. And at this point, it looks likely that the Swiss taxpayer and their DIF will be off the hook for this giant bank's failure. And the difference was contingent capital. Because when Credit Suisse got into serious trouble, their contingent capital triggered and injected $17 billion of equity into Credit Suisse. This was absolutely essential to finding a buyer for Credit Suisse.
Bien, entonces la diferencia entre un rescate, lo que hizo Credit Suisse, ellos inyectan capital en el banco para que no perjudique a la persona que es el depositante. Una fianza es donde convierten la deuda en el capital y lo venden en el mercado abierto. Y alguien con más de $250,000, si están en una venta en el mercado abierto, si se le sobra dinero a ese deudor, ahora la persona con el depósito obtendrá parte de ese capital.
Since, as you know, Credit Suisse was bought for about $3 billion, but only after the $17 billion of capital injection by their contingent capital.
Entonces lo que están diciendo es que debido a que tenían un plan en marcha, inyectaron el capital, pudieron conseguir un comprador que ayudó a los depositantes y a los contribuyentes que no tenían que pagarlo.
Swiss contingent capital succeeded at its two design objectives. First, to prevent contagion, and secondly, to keep the Swiss taxpayer off the hook for the failure of a truly giant bank. Now, if Silicon Valley Bank had been forced to carry an appropriate amount of contingent capital, then capital would have been automatically injected sometime probably Friday at the latest. And it was very likely that a buyer could have been found over the weekend as well. And we would not be having this hearing today. In fact, it's possible that they would not have gotten in trouble in the first place, since Silicon Valley Bank would have had to answer not only to the regulators, but to the bond markets for their risky practices. When they went through their gigantic growth spurt, they would have had to issue a lot of contingent capital instruments. And I'm pretty confident that one of the wizards in the bond market would have said, this is interesting. This bank is, has very flighty deposits and essentially no risk management in place. Maybe we should charge a pretty big risk premium, and the markets might have detected that. So my question is this, Vice Chair Barr, as part of your holistic review of bank capital requirements, will you commit to finally seriously considering contingent capital requirements in the capital stacks of large banks?
Thank you very much for your question, and I very much appreciated our conversations over the years on this very question of contingent capital instruments. Both the FDIC and we have issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking of a different type of contingent instrument, a gone concern capital instrument that would be required for large banks. But I think it does make sense to consider alternative options, and I'd be happy to continue the conversations with you about that.
Okay, and I would specifically appreciate it if your analysis included a counterfactual analysis of how much better off we would have been if regulators had listened to Congress and included contingent capital requirements into the capital stacks of these banks.
Entonces, estos requisitos de capital, entonces, cuando están hablando de inyecciones de capital, eso es prender la máquina de impresión de nuevo, chicos. Y este tipo es parte del Comité de Activos Digitales. Así que solo estoy tratando de juntar las cosas. No sé, pero estudio macroeconomía todo el tiempo, pero la única forma de inyectar capital es imprimir más dinero.
From just the counterfactual analysis. I'd like to just close out by finishing up a little bit with questions about the non-responsiveness of SVB management to the early warnings they got. Is there leverage that we can provide you? An obvious one is to say all of these matters requiring immediate attention and so on are private. And what, for example, if they had to become public after 60 days, if they were not resolved, would that have lit a fire under the chair of the management? Are there other things? For example, you could say any management that had an ongoing pending MR matters requiring immediate attention, we would simply put all the bonuses in escrow. That would almost certainly get their attention. So if you could include these sort of ideas, I'd appreciate it.
Recuerda, les pagaron sus bonos el viernes a la salida. Estos tipos no se hacen responsables de esta mierda, así que tienen que cuidarse, hombres. Y sé que esto no es emocionante, no es, ya sabes, Bitcoin a 100,000. Esta es la materia que necesitas entender para convertirte en un inversionista inteligente. Tienes que entender los movimientos que están haciendo. Todavía nos quedan unos 6 minutos en nos quedan 8 minutos en esto, así que aguanta por ahí.
For the record, Mr. Greenberg, Mr. Barr, Now recognize Mr. Emmer of Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman McHenry. Thanks for holding this important hearing today. The collapse of 3 regional banks over the course of 2 weeks is directly related to failed Democrat policies. Record inflation as a result of reckless government spending led to historic interest rates that banks were not ready to manage. It appears financial regulators were not appropriately communicating financial risks of the high-rate economy with banks in their supervisory capacity, and this administration's political attack, quite frankly, from the highest levels of our government on the digital asset industry, which, by the way, had nothing to do with causing the runs, sparked fear, leading to bank runs at Silvergate, Silicon Valley Bank, and apparently Signature, bringing these core issues plaguing our economy and the broader banking sector to the surface. Let's not be fooled. Providing financial services to legal businesses in the U.S. should not be risky. But this past month has proven that the mismanagement of our monetary policy has apparently made it risky to put dollars in a bank. Mr. Grunberg, will the FDIC sell off Signature's deposits from...
No seamos negligentes, pero básicamente habló de su ataque a la industria de activos digitales. Como que, ¿qué diablos está pasando? Ahora es arriesgado de poner su dinero en el banco. Lo está diciendo aquí mismo, señor Emerson. ¿Es arriesgado poner su dinero en el banco?
digital asset businesses? Yes or no?
We're returning those deposits to the depositors, Congressman.
So, okay. Does the FDIC plan to sell the intellectual property for Signet?
I believe that's already been sold out of the bridge institution, Congressman.
All right, we would like to see that information. Will you commit that a bank that buys Signet will be able to use it to facilitate 24/7 access to the banking system for digital asset companies?
Boom. You're going to hear this over and over.
¡Pum! Vas a escuchar eso una y otra vez. 24/7, acceso a los fondos, servicios FedNow. En julio, se va en vivo dentro de sus bancos.
I'm happy to look into that. I don't know who the buyer was, but be glad to look into it and follow up with you in regard.
You're not going to block the buyer from doing 24/7 banking for digital asset companies, is that correct?
If that's the nature of the acquisition.
Te están diciendo lo que viene, muchachos. Te están dando el plano.
And will you commit that a bank that buys Signet, or the bank that did, will be able to onboard new digital asset customers?
Again, I'd like to look into the transaction, but I'd be glad to follow up with you in regard to it.
When the FDIC sold off Silicon Valley Bank's deposits to First Citizens, did that include deposits from any digital asset firms or VCs in the digital asset space?
I believe all of the deposits from the failed Silicon Valley Bank were transferred to First Citizens.
Including the digital?
All of them, yes.
Were all of SVB's deposits from digital asset businesses, again, transferred to Citizens? That's what you're saying?
My understanding, First Citizens assumed all the deposits of the failed.
Has the FDIC ever communicated implicitly or explicitly, sir, to any banks that their supervision will be more onerous in any way if they take on new or maintain existing digital asset clients?
No.
Thank you. The FDIC estimates that resolving Signature Bank is going to lead to a $2.5 billion loss to the Deposit Insurance Fund, and resolving Silicon Valley will lead to a $20 billion loss to the Deposit Insurance Fund. When the FDIC sold Signature, it had the effect of closing Signet, which is an innovative payment system that facilitated 24/7 access to banking services. Frankly, a private sector.
Bien, desglosemos algunas cosas más. Les voy a mostrar una parte más de este video, ¿bien? Entonces, solo quiero compartir con ustedes, Ripple Labs nombra a Michael Barr como asesor. Eso fue 2015. Ese es el señor que estaba hablando al principio, ahí está. Ahora sabemos que el ex asesor de Ripple, Michael Barr, está supervisando la Reserva Federal, así que él es uno en el banquillo. Esta es otra dama, Nellie Lang, subsecretaria de Finanzas Internas. Ella fue parte de esta audiencia, no hablaron demasiado con ella, eso es interesante. Así que la FDIC nombra 3 nuevos miembros y resolución sistemática Comité de Prevención. Déjame repetir eso. FDIC. FDIC, quien hace los rescates. nombra 3 miembros de su comité asesor de resolución sistemática. Jay Clayton, que inició el caso contra Repo, irónicamente eso probablemente se resolverá muy pronto, es parte de la junta de la FDIC, Comité de Consejo de la Resolución Sistemática. No sé, muchachos, hay conexiones aquí. Están tratando de ralentizar a Repo. Algo viene. Así que mire este último video. Gracias por quedarte aquí. El material es muy importante. No es emocionante, pero información que cambiará la vida.
Your endurance here today and yesterday. And as I listened to my colleague ask questions, I know my constituents are tired of seeing Washington, D.C., Congress in particular, socialize risk and watch profits be privatized. They're also tired of people that don't listen. So I think one of the things that, Mr. Barr, when I was listening to what you said yesterday and today, S2155 isn't the reason that these banks failed. These banks were over $100 billion in assets, and therefore it's just a red herring. Isn't that accurate?
What I would say is that the Federal Reserve's rules issued in the wake of 2019, in the wake of the legislation that were issued in 2019, they did have the effect of lowering supervisory and regulatory standards for firms, but the Federal Reserve retains the discretion to have different rules. And one of the things that I think would be my job going forward is to put in place rules that are appropriate for that size institution. We have the discretion to do that.
Yeah, thank you. And so obviously it wasn't the regulation per se that failed, it was the regulator that failed. And I want to understand the context in which that occurred. So over the past year and a half, we've seen a substantial increase in the federal funds rate. And during that span, are you aware if the Fed or other prudential regulators had conversations not specific to Silicon Valley Bank about the inevitable interest rate risk that presents?
Yes, that is a core topic in supervision. Supervisors were very focused on interest rate risk. It was an important part of what we highlighted in our fall supervision report. Examiners were given beginning this year extra training, beginning last year, extra training on interest rate risk. So it is just a bread and butter supervisory issue. It's not some esoteric problem.
So in that sense, did Silicon Valley Bank's failure surprise you?
Its failure did surprise me. Its risk-taking was excessive, but even then, I did not anticipate, I don't think anybody anticipated that they'd have a devastating bank run that basically wiped out, $42 billion on Thursday afternoon, another $100 billion expected the next day. That would be 85% of its deposit base in a 24-hour period. That was shocking.
Yeah, so we're anxious to understand all the factors that drove that run on that particular bank, but we're also curious when you stated yesterday to Senator Kennedy that...
Quiero recapitular eso, chicos. Ustedes piensan en eso. 185 billones en 24 horas debido a la velocidad de la banca digital. Esto es de lo que nos estamos enfrentando ahora mismo. Saben que esto es a lo que se enfrentan. Tienen que hacer que el dinero se mueva a la velocidad de la luz. Necesitan velocidad de dinero o el sistema colapsará.
Stress testing does not examine institutional risks precipitating from interest rate risk. And when we were on the conference call with Treasury, with Fed, with FDIC, with House and Senate Republicans and Democrats, I asked the question, and there's some complex model that the stress test involves. And said, well, if macroeconomic conditions and whatever kick in, well, I submit that the hold to maturity spread has to be considered. Not just the available for sale risk because of the need for liquidity. Is that something that you're focused on as you conduct your review?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right that we need to look at both sides of the balance sheet. We need to look at the liability structure and the asset structure and the whole.
Okay, he says something really important. Pay attention right here.
Point is to assess whether under certain conditions, you can have more stress on the liability side that forces you to sell on the asset side. Those are interrelated.
Mr. Grunberg, do you share that concern about how we're looking at systemic risk?
Yes, I do, Congressman.
I would love to go into everything that I could on this, but Mr. Barr, on March 9th, you gave a speech that touched on stablecoins and brought up specific
This is important. Listen.
risks associated with stablecoins. In that speech, you stated, quote, this mismatch in value and liquidity is the recipe for a classic bank run. Stablecoin issuers are not supervised by the Fed and lack capital and liquidity as a backstop. The banks we regulate, in contrast, are well protected from bank runs through a robust array of supervisory requirements. Would you revise those comments if you could?
Yes, I think that
Básicamente está diciendo que las stablecoins están jodidas. Bien, adivina que él está diciendo tenía la Reserva Federal que se supone que debe estar vigilando los bancos. Acaba de tener una corrida bancaria y no lo supervisaste. Sabían que las tasas de interés se acercaban.
it demonstrates the need for humility in thinking about how financial risk happens in the system. That's been a theme of basically all of my academic work on systemic risk is we need humility, and that's why you need really strict capital and liquidity rules because of exactly the kind of circumstance we just saw.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'll note, obviously, stable coins are backed by assets and are properly regulated in many states, including the state of New York. Last thing I'd say is we have this pressure to socialize more of the market. There are credit unions that are completely privately insured, many in my district and in others, and I think we should look to that market for private credit risk insurance. I yield.
The gentleman yields, the gentlewoman.
All right, fam.
Muy bien, familia, sé esas cosas. Yo, para mí, eso es emocionante. Sé que es emocionante para ustedes también. Así que solo quería compartir con ustedes esa información. Hay una audiencia de 3 horas, 5 horas. Así que vi casi el 90% de eso sumergiéndome en eso, realmente tratando de entender lo que está pasando con el sistema bancario. Ayer estuve en un banco haciendo una transacción. Las cosas están cambiando, te lo prometo. Las personas que están sintiendo la frecuencia saben que algo viene. Servicios FedNow llega en julio, 24/7, pagos en tiempo real, liquidez en demanda. Vamos a conseguir un acuerdo de repo probablemente aquí en un futuro próximo y las cosas van a cambiar bastante dramáticamente en su sistema bancario. De nuevo, mantengan la calma, muchachos. No te asuste. Compra la caída, manos de diamante. Cuando hay sangre en las calles, compra. Cuando todo el mundo es codicioso, debería estar vendiendo. Debe estar preparado con un plan de salida. No vaya a hacerse rico rápido. Cualquier YouTuber, Instagram, TikToker que está siguiendo, que está tratando de emocionarte acerca de hacerte rico rápidamente, fracasarás. Te lo prometo, el 100% de las veces fracasarás. Es una solución fundamental del mundo real a largo plazo. Invertir a largo plazo y crear riqueza generacional. Hemos ayudado a más de 6,000 guerreros en todo el mundo a prepararse durante COVID y entrando en este nuevo sistema financiero cuántico. No somos asesores financieros, simplemente documentando todo nuestro viaje. En la descripción de abajo de este video puedes aplicar para coaching privado o puedes unirte a nuestra academia abierta y ser parte de un ecosistema de personas con ideas afines subiendo juntos. No estamos en contra de nadie, no estamos protestando, no estamos arreglando y trabajando más duro en nosotros mismos que en cualquier otra cosa.
Warriors, rise, get your shit together. Let's go.
El sistema está diseñado para mantenerte atrapado. 2017 salí de un trabajo de vicepresidente bien pagado porque yo estaba absolutamente miserable. Trabajando de 16 a 19 horas al día, porque eso es lo que el sistema me enseñó a hacer. Y lo que descubrí a través de incontables horas de meditación, investigación, leyendo libros, entendiendo cómo operan los millonarios y billonarios, el sistema está diseñado para mantenerte atrapado. Hoy en día soy dueño de varias empresas, viajo por el mundo, soy financieramente libre y es exactamente por eso que creé esta comunidad de guerreros de ideas afines que se unen llamada 3T Warrior Academy. Ahora, no digo esto para presumir, comparto esto contigo para mostrarte lo que es posible para ti, ya sea que recién esté comenzando o estás buscando llevar tu vida a otro nivel. Creemos que la Academia de Guerreros tiene algo para todos. Procesos que te llevan paso a paso a través de la disciplina, actividades consistentes, y eso es exactamente lo que vas a conseguir. Nuestro reto de 120 días, todo lo que tienes que hacer es abrir la aplicación y llevarla día a día. Te vamos a llevar a la disciplina y las actividades consistentes para llevar a tu vida al siguiente nivel. Dentro de una semana vas a notar una diferencia. Dentro de un mes, la gente va a notar un cambio en ti. Así de poderoso es este reto de 120 días. Entonces, si realmente estás listo para liberarte del viejo paradigma a un nuevo paradigma de disciplina, consistencia, gran relación con tu familia, libertad financiera y aprendiendo los pilares de riqueza, eso cambiará tu vida en riqueza generacional por venir. Te voy a invitar a hacer nuestro programa durante 7 días gratis. El reto de 120 días ha cambiado 5,000 guerreros de todo el mundo y esperamos que tú seas el próximo.
Warriors, let's get you together. Let's go.